Hello my wonderful, beautiful friends guys, welcome back to our /EntitledPeople, where people truly believe they can do what they want, when they want, and nobody else matters. And in today's episode, we've got customers losing it on employees, new nasty neighbors getting taught lessons, and one OP tells the story about the time a smug Karen boss gets hired and thinks he owns the place. Guys, I hope you enjoy the stories today. Don't shake your heads too hard, and as always, you can send or link your post to this email right here. Let's dive in. I work at a hardware store with a garden department. We get rude and entitled customers all the time, but this one incident that happened a long time ago still sticks with me. So the garden department sells bales of pine straw that's in a trailer in the parking lot, locked behind a gate. One day, I get called outside to help a guy with 50 bales. No problem. I was on the phone when I went out there with another customer, and when I arrived, the guy had jumped over the locked gates and he was inside the locked trailer. So I waved the guy over and I asked him politely to get out. The guy mumbled how he'd been waiting forever and whatnot. I tell the guy, "Sir, you can't be in the trailer, that's why it's locked." The guy replies, "I've been waiting for over half an hour, I need to go. Time is money." I replied, "Yes sir, I'm here to help." So we continue to load the 50 bales without one word being said. It takes about 10 minutes. After we're finished, he proceeds to yell at me. The guy says to me, "I don't appreciate you waving me over. From a customer service standpoint, that's terrible service, and you're lucky I don't kick your ass right here, right now for the insult." Of course, I'm taken aback, and I respond, what? I don't think I said anything insulting. I just asked you to get out of the locked trailer." He then says to me, "When you were on the phone, which was incredibly rude too, you used your phone to wave me out of the trailer." I tell him, "Yes, well, I was on the phone with another customer, and if that offended you, I can't help you any further. On the second note, I asked you to get out of the trailer because 1, it's not safe, and if you would have tripped on some straw, we would have been liable, and 2, you jumped over a locked gate, so you're at fault anyways." The guy basically says to me again, "You'd better hope I don't come back here after I finish my job and kick your ass, because that's what I might do." Anyways, after this outburst, I informed my manager of the incident, who calmly then called the guy's company and told them we don't want them back at our store anymore. And if we spot that guy, we will issue a trespassing charge and call the cops. Obviously, the owner's pissed and he tried to get us to change our decision. But I don't know what happened next. And here's an idea. The next time you threaten someone at a store, don't wear your shirt with your company's name on it to trace it back to you. Effing tough guy mentality right there, right? Climbs over a locked gate and then threatens an employee for telling him he can't do that. Like, I just can't get over how extreme that response is, and I hope he was reprimanded for that, because that's not how you should ever represent any company you work for, because it's unprofessional. And let's just say, even if OP was a bit rude, that guy's immediate response should not be to assault somebody. And I love how the manager handled it though. And guys, I do have a question for people who work in retail. How do you deal with people who are banned from stores? Like hundreds, if not thousands of people probably frequent that store on a daily basis. So how would anybody stop that dude if he were to come back and shop? I'd really love to know. So as an only child growing up, I was often spoiled, and my mom let me get away with a lot of stuff. I also tended to get bored, and I sometimes liked to do telephone pranks. Now usually these pranks were very tame. I would call a random phone number and I would creepily breathe into the phone, while the other person would say, "Hello, hello," until they eventually hung up, and I moved on to the next number. One afternoon though, some middle-aged lady got super angry. I guess she was the 90s version of a Karen. When she realized I was a child, she gives me an angry lecture how I was misbehaving and how it was unacceptable. Now, I don't know what it was about her, but something about her butthurt yelping got me really triggered too. I was actually a really sweet and well-behaved boy, and most adults loved me. Perhaps because of that, it really rubbed me the wrong way when she called me a snotty brat. I felt treated unfairly and I wanted to give her a crappy day. So I laughed in a rude tone and I said something like, "Yeah, well, you possibly couldn't know because you are as dumb as rocks." There was a short pause. The woman was clearly stunned by my words before she totally freaks out. At this point, I let loose like my 10-year-old tongue had never let loose before. I called her a nasty witch, a dumb, good-for-nothing, ugly housewife whose husband probably hates her, every nasty disease, you name it. Any insult that came to my mind, I promptly hurled at her. Now, some of the things I called her were hilarious, but some of them were 100% over the boundary. As in, I would be angry if my child said them to an adult, let alone a complete stranger. At one point, the lady said to me, "Just you wait, you little brat. I have your phone number and I'll call your parents." And here's the thing. At the time, most telephones weren't capable of knowing and showing the caller's number. At the time, caller ID was still a pretty new technology. So when the lady claimed to have my landline phone number, the one I was calling from, I assumed it was a bluff, and I laughed in her face harder, and I called her an idiot once again. Unfortunately, it wasn't a bluff. About 15 minutes later, the woman calls back, and my mom picks up before I could stop her. At this point, I was genuinely terrified. Some of the things I said were pretty horrible, and I knew my mom would hate it. Surely there would be some ugly punishment. Instead, however, I hear my mom reply in a polite but skeptical tone saying, "No, you must have dialed the wrong phone number. My son would never do that." Like I said, I was usually a goody two-shoes who was always nice to everyone, and I brought home good grades from school, so it made sense for my mom to be very skeptical, and yet that angry lady was totally right about what I'd done. After some back and forth, my mom called me and she said, "Hey, so there's a lady here who claims you called her before and you insulted her horribly. Is that true?" I gave her my most innocent smile and I said, "Huh? Insulted her? No, I was playing in my room all day. I didn't call anyone." My mom just said to me, "Yeah, I thought so." She then goes back on the phone and she said to the lady, "I just asked my son and he says he didn't do any such thing. I also don't think he would ever do such a thing. And frankly, you seem like you've got some screws loose. Don't you dare call us anymore. You probably misdialed or maybe you imagined the whole thing." I heard the woman screaming and she was shouting in anger, and then my mom hung up on her and simply went back to her gardening work. I never told my mom that that crazy lady actually hadn't been crazy, and that she had actually been saying the truth. Okay, so this might be an unpopular opinion, but I feel like OP and his mom were the bratty entitled ones in this. Like, I don't know, maybe I'm just the person who's not a fan of prank phone calls because I used to have it happen to me all the time, guys. And I know how annoying it is to get prank calls. Like, who wouldn't lose their mind and give somebody crap for doing that, right? And I get how it's funny to some people, but I do feel bad for that Karen who was gaslit into thinking nothing happened. That poor woman. So this is a long story, and I hope you enjoy it. I met this guy named Grumpy in Narcotics Anonymous. He volunteered there after they helped him and became my sponsor. Seeing that I was trying to get my stuff together, he offered me my first job out of high school. Grumpy was the manager of a store for a company that sold everything you needed to build a house. From cement and bricks to custom-made cupboards, they sold everything. I started as a loader, filling the trucks that were making deliveries. And here's a little background for the company. When they started back in the early 80s, they sold everything you needed to build a brick-and-mortar home wholesale to professionals. During their first expansion, they got a really good reputation for their prices of power tools, custom cupboards, and landscaping, including custom-made garden furnitures. The stores were basically big warehouses. In the mid-90s, they opened their doors to the general public, which, accompanied by a rising tent of DIY, skyrocketed their sales. That brought a second, smaller wave of expansion and the opening of the online store. When I joined, they were doing a third shift on their business plan. They had cut down on things that weren't big sellers, like bricks and concrete, and they were focusing more on the big sellers, like custom-made furniture, landscaping, tools, and for some weird reason, plumbing. That said, my first 8 months on the job was a dream. Grumpy was an excellent manager. Having started in the company roughly the same age I was and being promoted through the ranks, he had developed a very distinct managerial style. His concept was simple: if my employees are happy, they work better, and they provide better services, which leads to better sales. That meant that while Grumpy managed one of the inner city stores, meaning medium to small size compared to others, we were 4th in revenue nationwide and 1st in customer happiness. And then the reason for his nickname strikes. While everyone called him Grumpy, a nickname he was kind of proud of, he was far from it. The reason was, he had this medical condition that affected his nerves, and had left him with a permanent frown on his face. His medical condition flared up unexpectedly, and Grumpy had to be hospitalized and on sick leave for a time. Upper management decided to not have one of Grumpy's assistants be acting manager for the duration, but they would bring in a regional manager to take over the store for the duration. Let's call him Wilhelm. Now, this guy was the exact opposite of Grumpy. The guy was younger than Grumpy by about 10 years, and he had a shiny business degree, which gave him a stuck-up, entitled sense of attitude, and he hadn't worked the floor at all. He was hired from the beginning as an office drone, and he climbed his way to regional manager. The reason why he was put in charge of our store had to do with the change of the business plan of the company. You see, the change of focus had created a lot of empty space in the stores. A supermarket chain had approached the company with an offer to rent the empty space, especially for the inner city stores. The company had accepted, and they placed regional managers in key stores to help with integration. And here's the thing, the supermarket chain had a reputation of being bad employers. This was reinforced by one of our tellers who had worked for them 3 years before quitting to join us. Wilhelm didn't help also. His managerial style was based on only one concept: to make more money in any way possible, no matter what. The guy started by changing our schedule from monthly to weekly, and raising the sales targets to unrealistic heights, and always demanded more. In the first 2 weeks of him being there, 6 experienced people had left. 4 quit and 2 were fired, and they were replaced by young, inexperienced people that were easier to manipulate. And then the integration happened. The floor was the first to feel the problem. The supermarket opened its doors and they were understaffed. Wilhelm started sending people over to help for 4 to 6 hours, while also demanding to work their regular shift. And if someone declined, he or she was written up. 2 write-ups in 6 months and you were fired. Then, Wilhelm came to lay the law in the loading bay. The loading bay was shared between the 2 stores. He declared that we had to first help the 2 guys of the supermarket unload their trucks first, because their products were perishable, and then start loading our own trucks. That would throw our delivery schedule to the wind. The loading crew worked from 5 a.m. to 1 p.m. We always loaded the trucks that had longer to travel first, so they'd be ready to leave at 7 p.m. the latest. What Wilhelm declared meant we couldn't start loading our trucks before 7:30. And they couldn't start their route before 9:30. Now, we said as much, but Wilhelm didn't care. He said we had to do both jobs, and when somebody inquired about overtime, Wilhelm said no. He said we made too much money with unsocial hours and leaving early, so he wouldn't approve overtime. So from a nice environment that you wanted to work for, we all start getting miserable. We lost 10 people in the loading crew in a month because of the new rules. The new hires also didn't last long, and the floor was a mess also, and we started going through personnel faster than ever. Anyone who was staying is either looking for another job, or is afraid of unemployment, or is too young to know better. The sales had a very small decline, but customer happiness is plummeting fast. After almost 6 months, everyone who was left was ready to quit, but that's when our savior came back. Almost 6 months from the day he was hospitalized, Grumpy walks into the store to claim his rightful position. He's in normal attire, slightly limping and holding a cane. We have a welcome back party and have a small glimmer of hope now that he's back. We're then informed that Grumpy will be on light duties for 2 weeks before he becomes the manager again. Now, despite Grumpy being back, Wilhelm still remains the regional manager, which means he outranks Grumpy, and he makes it very clear in meetings with all of us. He actually told us if he caught us complaining to Grumpy, we were as good as gone. Still, even a few of us are planning to have a meeting with Grumpy after a few weeks, letting him get his sea legs back, but another department had other ideas. During his reign of terror, the only department that Wilhelm couldn't control was the workshop. He knew that if he treated them as bad as he did us, they would quit, and sales would go from a small decline to bottom of the barrel really quick. As I said, custom-made furniture was the #1 seller. So that said, the head carpenter has a meeting with Grumpy on his second day back, talking about the quote, future of the workshop. In reality, the guy spilled the beans on Wilhelm. With the pretext of catching up with the changes, Grumpy has meetings with everyone, learning what Wilhelm's had done and why we had so many new staff. You could tell that he was getting angrier with every meeting. He also had an eye-opening meeting with the manager of the supermarket. Finally, the time comes that he's the manager again. On his first day back as a manager, Grumpy notifies everyone of a mandatory meeting after the store is closed. He has a solution, so gather in the store after closing hours, and that's when Grumpy lays out the plan. For the next couple of days, no one except him is coming to the store. If anyone calls us, we should direct them to him, which we did. We then start getting calls about the store being closed. Grumpy's answer to headquarters was simple. The staff was working on a second job during their shifts, which is a breach of contract, so I had to fire them all and find new staff. Now this caught headquarters' attention because nothing of the sort was reported in the past 6 months. They asked Grumpy for evidence, which he happily provided with our written testimonies, which brought a crap storm on Wilhelm. You see, Wilhelm had this arrangement with the supermarket manager. He got a kickback from our unpaid labor for the supermarket, and the manager offered the same thing to Grumpy. He also included that Wilhelm regularly declined to sign overtime, which meant that if any one of us went to the labor department, the company would get a really huge fine. So what happened after that is Wilhelm quickly got fired. We all received calls to interview with the company for an open position. We also received severance pay for our firing, plus most of the unpaid overtime, about 80% of it. Almost all of us went back to work with a small pay raise based on experience. Also, the company took a long, hard look on the supermarket chain, and they distanced themselves from them. The next time Grumpy had to take time off, one of his assistants took over. 2 did a stellar job, leading them to be promoted to managers in other stores. Grumpy brought back his usual managerial style, leading again to a rise of sales and customer happiness. I left the job 3 years later for a better paying position, but I still remember Grumpy as one of the best managers I've ever had. He sure sounds like it, and I'll never understand why this simple point is so lost on management guys. Like, it is so rare to have a manager value their employees and not just treat them as a number and disposable. And it's so true about employees working hard for their good bosses. Like, you just want to go above and beyond working for someone who is super duper nice to you and not have a superiority complex. That said though, what Wilhelm did was super duper illegal, expecting employees to work for free. Like, how the heck did he think that was going to work? So last spring, my old neighbor, who was a saint, sold her house and moved away. The people that moved in were awful. The guy who we'll call Pete owns some sort of a new black Mustang that sounds like it has no muffler, and he revs it up and down the neighborhood streets in the evenings, literally 5 days a week, when a lot of people, myself included, sit on the back porch and watch TV during the summer. It's relentless. The guy also drives up and down the state highway that's on the other side of my house, doing the same thing, but louder, because it's a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit. You can hear it for miles. And the guy has friends over regularly in the backyard, and they just sit there on the weekends and some weeknights, revving up the car. It's truly so loud that you can't do anything but wait for him to be done. There was a big conversation in the HOA group, and a bunch of neighbors politely asked him not to do this. And Pete's exact response is, "I pay a lot of money for this house. I will do what I want in my own yard, and the streets are public." Well, I didn't like that, so here's what I did next. Our subdivision has about 150 houses on about 300 acres. It's big. Most of the properties in this subdivision are between 1 to 4 acres in size. I have a 3-acre corner. Well, I also know from 15 years of living here that anytime I have a fire on the side of the yard next to Pete's, the smoke is guaranteed to travel in the direction of Pete's house. I know this because I couldn't ever have a fire when my old neighbor was outside, as it would literally fill her backyard with smoke. So I moved my fire pit about a dozen years ago to the other side of my house and towards the road, so I could be a good neighbor. So Pete letting me know that he wouldn't quit making noise reminded me that I just loved having my fire pit right back where it was a dozen years ago. It took me a single weekend to dig up the pavers and the blocks and move them back to my preferred spot and get myself a fire going in my new fire pit. I just needed to wait until Pete had people over. And here's the thing. I made sure the first fire was a good one. Pete had friends over and it was a nice day, so I started the fire. Got it just about started, and then I added all the wettest, grossest wood that I could find. About 10 minutes later, Pete and all of his friends were visibly upset by the stench, so they all went inside. They came back a little later, and I add more wet, nasty wood, and they went inside again. I kept that up the entire day, and then I added a bunch of grass clippings to keep it going overnight. The next day, still smoldering, it was still smelling awful. I then put out a Facebook post on the HOA website and let people know that I would be continuing to utilize my fire pits as often as possible so they could bring me all their lawn scraps. I had about 20 people respond in a few hours saying their clippings were all mine, and I kept that fire going. My dogs are good alarms and they rush outside anytime anyone's in Pete's backyard, so I would hear the dog scramble, go outside, and add more clippings. After about 3 weeks, Pete and his wife came out and they very kindly asked me what was going on with the fire pit. She very politely informed me that her hair would smell like campfire if she went into her backyard for any amount of time, and they could smell it coming into their house through their ductwork. He said I was making it hard for him to enjoy his backyard with his friends. They then asked if I could ease back with the fire because I probably didn't know it was impacting their life so much. I just looked at him and his wife, and I said it was clear that sometimes we don't recognize how big of an effect something could have on our neighbors until they told us about it. But that's when I add, as objectively as possible, that normally I live by the same I'll do what I want in my yard thought process as Pete does. I have a right to enjoy my yard. I then looked Pete dead in the eyes and I said, and I know you support that because of how the conversation concluded about your car, right, Pete? At that moment, he looked at me like I scratched his favorite CD. The guy knew what I was doing, and that's when his wife looked at him and it dawned on her. She then says to me, she gets it, we won't hear the Mustang anymore. And I said, thanks. I took a gamble and I put the fire out right after that. It was the right call. Pete was respectful after that. See, this is a great example of F around and find out, isn't it? And I just love how the wife immediately understood what was going on and she was like, okay, that is stopping right now. Because feuds with your neighbors can make your life miserable sometimes. And the funny thing is, like the people that often say, I can do what I want, blah blah blah, often forget that others can do the same as well. Again, the way Opie handled it was frickin' brilliant. Okay, so my wife and I were homeless at the time and living out of my car. We were at the library one day, and my wife was inside trying to get some paperwork done and trying to get us any help she could, while I was in the car using my laptop to fill out job applications. I was in the crowded parking lot when this SUV pulls into the spot next to me. It was a really fancy, shiny vehicle, though I couldn't tell you what make or model. This tall, skinny woman with a Karen haircut then throws her door open and she dings the crap out of my car. The impact was so hard it shook my car, so I looked up. The woman climbs out of the car and she locks eyes with me, but she doesn't say a word. There was no sorry, no my bad, nothing. And to be fair, my car was a beater, and if she would have apologized, I would have just laughed and said, please, you can't make this car look any worse if you tried. And that would have been that. But the woman locked eyes with me and she didn't say an effing word. She just turned and walked into the library. And I just sat there steaming over it for the next 30 minutes. When my wife came back to the car, I decided to get back at the woman. I opened the car door for her hard, 3 times in quick succession. The SUV's door wasn't looking so pretty and shiny anymore. My wife got in and we drove away. Now, I wish I could say I felt guilt over it, but I don't. It was probably one of the most satisfied feelings I've ever had in my life. And I know that some of you might say that I'm such an a-hole for doing this, but damn, it was such a good feeling when it happened. So am I the a-hole in this situation? You know what, in my opinion, I think both parties kind of suck here, and they both could have done better. Like, was it satisfying to do that to Karen after she dinged his car and didn't give a damn about it? Yes, it was. But was it also an a-hole move for OP to return the action threefold and to dent the crap out of Karen's car? I would also say yes. Like, I'm not endorsing it, but some people need to learn a lesson. And I'm only saying that because I know what it's like to come out to my vehicle and have a nice dent in the side door, because some people literally don't care about other people's vehicles and they just swing their door open full force. But guys, let me know your thoughts. Leave your comments down below. What would you do in this situation? And that, my friends, brings us to another end of our / entitled people. Guys, I hope you enjoyed today's stories. If you did, hit that thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing so you don't miss these crazy stories. And if you missed the last episode on the channel, it's in our / I don't work here lady, where Karens are trying to cause trouble in stores. It's such a wild episode. So go check it out if you haven't, and myself and Stevie Boy will see you guys in the next one. We love you.